This is Claudius Galen. From the 2nd to the 16th century, he was the most famous physician in the world. If you studied medicine in medieval Europe, you would have learned his version of anatomy, along with a few other texts. Galen's work was so well respected that despite inaccuracies in his version of anatomy, almost nobody dissected a human body for about 1,300 years after his work was published. Or at least, that's how the story usually goes. The story leaves out two interesting threads that we're gonna pull on in this video. One, while it's true that Christian Europe wasn't doing much with dissection, Islamic scholars were learning a ton about human anatomy and compiling an enormous body of knowledge. And two, that centuries-long drought in dissection didn't end overnight in 1543 with Andreas Vesalius like he usually gets credit for. So I wondered, what had to happen culturally to make dissection acceptable again in Europe? This is why doctors didn't dissect for over 1,000 years. In the last video, we talked about how Galen became such a big deal in the history of medicine. He had built his model of human anatomy from animal anatomy, especially pigs, monkeys, and Barbary apes, which were actually macaques, but that's by the by. And because of that, he had some bad takes about human anatomy. As an example, plenty of rodents have a two-piece jaw that joins in the middle, so Galen thought that the human mandible, or jaw, was two halves instead of one whole. Or how humans have opposable thumbs and have unique muscles to move them. But since Galen dissected animals without human thumbs, he never identified those important thumb muscles. Galen also believed that there were pores in the interventricular septum of the heart that let blood in from the right to the left ventricle, and that the atria, the chambers above the ventricles, weren't part of the heart. Not to get too morbid, but if you're an adult with a hole in your heart like that, that's bad. Part of the reason that his view of anatomy and implied cardiovascular physiology lasted for so long was because of the amazing preservation and translation efforts by Islamic scholars in the 9th century. Unfortunately, the traditional Eurocentric version of the story paints the Islamic scholars more as passive translators than active participants in science. And that's too bad, because these scholars were the ones who were keeping science alive in Europe while Christian Europe was in a centuries-long biology rut. Starting in the 9th century, we get the work of Rhazes, who gets called the father of Islamic medicine. What made him unique was his ability to read ancient Greco-Roman texts, but also to add his own commentary and experimentation. He even went so far as to write a book called Doubts About Galen. Rhazes was a well-rounded polymath, someone involved in multiple academic disciplines, so he combined philosophy, the arts, and science to create some of the first works on medical ethics, including the idea of the triumvirate of ethical responsibility. The patient has a responsibility to the physician has a responsibility to their patient, and the physician has a responsibility to themselves. Another giant in the history of medicine was Avicenna, who wrote around 300 science books in his lifetime, including books on astronomy, philosophy, and medicine. Here's a brief example from his Canon of Medicine. The heart has 3 cavities, 2 large ones and another, so to speak, in the middle, and a passage between the 2 large ones. This passage dilates when the heart dilates and contracts when the heart elongates. Sounds a little like Galen's model with the passage between the 2 ventricles, right? These scientists wrote enormous works about medicine and progressed medical science, but to this day, we're not totally sure whether they dissected human cadavers or not. Most accounts say that dissection was illegal in Islam back then, but some historians question just how illegal. According to 14th century Arabic dictionaries, the word for dissection, the science of anatomy, and forensic autopsy were all the same word, tashri. But later on, we see different Arabic scholars use different words for the different practices. So if we found an old law that said that tashri is illegal, it might be referring to dissection, or it might refer to autopsy. Context is important around this word. And then there's the legal confusion. Now, clearly, I'm not an expert in medieval Islamic law practices, but from what I've read, they would have observed laws directly from the Quran, the traditions attributed to the Prophet Muhammad, and the customs of the early Muslim community. Tashri isn't explicitly outlawed or approved of by any of those sources. Every now and then you'll get references to the treatment of corpses, but nothing specifically about dissection for the sake of learning anatomy. Side note, one of those references is instructions for an oil and borax enema in Al-Razi's book of medicine dedicated to Mansur. I mean, how else are you gonna make sure that your corpse has a totally evacuated bowel before embalming them, right? Now, even books specifically about medical law don't mention whether dissection was legal or not, animal or human. And you'd think that if a society was against something, they would mention it in legal books. Like, grave robbing was pretty clearly illegal. but the law was less clear about, say, burial practices. Supposedly, the Prophet Muhammad said, breaking the bones of a person when dead is like breaking them while they are living, which seems like dissection should be a no-go, right? But over the years, there have been different interpretations of that specific line that might require more context. All that's a long way of saying, the Islamic societies probably didn't dissect human cadavers, but they still made a bunch of advancements in physiology and medicine through other means. Take al-Baghdadi. He observed that the human mandible was one piece instead of two, which corrected Galen. He happened to visit Egypt in 1200 during a famine where thousands of people emaciated and died. He learned this new fact about the mandible by observing these corpses, not through dissection. And towards the end of the Golden Age of Islam, doctors throughout Europe would start opening up to dissection again. But before they did, a few things had to be in place. Which means we have to talk about the church. Christianity was the dominant religion in Europe at the time, and held that dissection was illegal. Then, in the Middle Ages, theologians started to distance the body on earth from the soul that would end up in heaven. After all, your body was the thing that tempted you towards sin in this world, so they weren't huge fans. The Italian monk Jacopone de Todi wrote a poem in the 1200s where Jesus judged the soul and the body on Judgment Day, and the soul says to the body, "See how his countenance is severe because of what we have done. We could have merited his kingdom, O miserable and disgusting body. See what we deserve now." The soul is saying that if it weren't for all the body's sins, the soul would have gotten into heaven. So once the church started imagining the body as sinful and corporeal, and the spirit as the thing that really matters, sure, why not cut some bodies apart after death? But they had to be the right kind of bodies. The corpses of kings and saints were treated differently than common folks or criminals. Prominent figures might have been dissected, but usually that was just for easier transportation before burial. For example, when King Henry of England died in 1135 in Normandy, it took about 2 weeks to get his remains from the continent to the burial place in England. That's a lot of time for decomposition and putrefaction to set in, so his handlers had to cut him up and salt him to dampen the smell. But more importantly for our story, around that time is when we see some of the first written records of dissection for the sake of autopsy start to show up around Italy. The first written record in Europe is from 1286, when Italian physicians started performing autopsies on folks in the middle of a disease epidemic. This was before germ theory or microscopes, so unless you saw anything glaringly obvious like a stab wound, the autopsy wasn't super useful. Regardless, performing autopsies steadily grew in popularity in Italy over the next few years. Dissection also showed up in the Arabian Peninsula by Ibn al-Nafis. His dissections directly led to fixing the error regarding the old hole between the ventricles idea, making him one of the first scholars in centuries to refute Galen like this. We don't know for sure when dissection started showing up in anatomy classrooms, but the earliest clear account of a teaching-focused dissection came from Mondino de Lucy, who described one in Anatomica in 1316. He tells us, "To begin a dissection, put the cadaver of the decapitated or hanged person in the supine position, and the study of these muscles is better done in the desiccated cadaver than in the cadaver of the recently hanged." Which implies that people back then might have had the heebie-jeebies dissecting a common person, but totally cool with it if they were a hanged criminal. And these dissections weren't in dimly lit rooms in the university, they were public. Dissection was a final, humiliating punishment for crimes. And since law enforcement didn't care about what happened to the criminal's body after death, physicians might as well hang out and poke around inside. But doctors still needed some kind of stimulus to take dissection as a science more seriously. Part of that stimulus would be a newfound excitement around scholarship itself. Universities became more common in Paris and Oxford, and Bologna and Padua in Italy. Another stimuli was Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II, who promoted publicly dissecting a body every 5 years, and made it mandatory for medical students and physicians to be there. Then in 1292, Pope Nicholas IV put out an official Pope statement saying that graduates from the University of Bologna could practice medicine anywhere in the world. Now obviously that's going to make Bologna a very attractive hotspot for medical education. And in 1315, our pal from earlier, Mondino de Lucy, performed the first documented, legal, public teaching dissection since Galen over 1400 years prior. From then on, Bologna held a few of these public dissections every year, always on executed criminals, always with permission from local authorities. So starting around this point in history, physicians at medical schools started voraciously consuming cadavers. Universities in Perugia, Padua, and Florence required their medical students to attend at least one dissection before graduation, and other Italian universities soon followed after. But they weren't using it as a way of discovering new things about the body. It was more like a real-life example of what the classic text described. a 3D model to accompany the 2D illustrations in the textbook. But starting in the late 1400s, a few well-to-do people in Italy were becoming very interested in the human body again, especially as portrayed by the Greeks and Romans. And all of a sudden, we realized that we were going to need to see the body in a little more detail.